The moment a woman stops begging for love is the moment everything begins to collapse around the man who took it for granted. The sound of a jet engine cut through the quiet morning sky, low and powerful, the kind of sound that turns heads even in a city that has seen everything, and at the top of a narrow set of polished stairs, Emily Carter paused with one hand resting gently on her 7-month pregnant belly, her expression calm, unreadable, almost too steady for someone who had just walked away from an entire life. 12 hours earlier, she had been standing in the dim hallway of a luxury hotel, the carpet soft under her feet, her heart beat loud in her ears as she recognized her husband's voice behind a closed door, followed by laughter that didn't belong to her world anymore, and for a moment, just a moment, everything inside her went still, not broken, not shattered, just quiet, like a switch had flipped somewhere deep beneath the surface. She didn't knock, she didn't cry, she didn't call his name. Instead she turned, pulled out her phone, and sent a single email that would begin unraveling everything. Daniel Brooks thought he controlled, back at their house, the one with floor-to-ceiling windows and carefully curated silence. The kitchen lights were still on when Daniel finally returned just after sunrise, his tie loose, his movements slow with the confidence of a man who believed explanations could wait. But the moment he stepped inside, something felt off, not messy, not chaotic, just empty, like the air itself had shifted. And then he saw it, sitting neatly on the marble counter, a single folder, a wedding ring placed precisely on top, and beneath it, a signed set of divorce papers with Emily's name written in a steady, deliberate hand. Upstairs, the closet was half cleared, drawers open but not ransacked, everything intentional, everything controlled, as if she had planned every second of her exit down to the inch. His phone buzzed, once, twice, then again, unfamiliar numbers. A law firm he didn't recognize, a name that didn't belong in his life. Julian Hayes, and suddenly the silence wasn't empty anymore, it was loud, pressing in, asking questions he didn't have answers for. Miles away, Emily stepped fully onto the private jet, the leather seats waiting, the door closing behind her with a quiet finality, and across from her sat Julian, composed, observant, not surprised, as if this moment had been expected long before it ever happened. And when she finally exhaled, slow and controlled, it wasn't relief that crossed her face, it was something sharper, something stronger. Something that didn't look like escape at all, because as the plane began to move, as the city shrank beneath them, there was only one truth left hanging in the air. Emily Carter hadn't just left her husband, she had taken something with her, something Daniel hadn't even realized he could lose, and whatever it was already too late to get it back. Daniel Brooks stood frozen in the center of his kitchen, the quiet no longer peaceful but suffocating, pressing in from every corner as if the walls themselves knew something he did not, and for the first time in years, he felt it, not anger, not even confusion, but uncertainty, sharp and unfamiliar. He picked up the folder again, flipping through the pages faster this time, legal language he barely skimmed. Until one detail made him stop, a clause about asset separation already pre-filed. Already processed, already in motion, and that was when his phone rang again, the same number, the same persistence, and this time he answered. The voice on the other end was calm, professional, controlled, introducing itself as a representative from Hayes Legal Group, confirming receipt of documentation submitted hours earlier by Emily Carter, requesting acknowledgement, requesting cooperation, requesting compliance. And the way they said her name, steady and formal, made it sound like she had already stepped into a world he was not part of. Daniel tried to interrupt, tried to ask questions, but the call ended as cleanly as it began, leaving him with nothing but silence and a name echoing in his mind, Julian Hayes. Upstairs, he moved quickly now, opening drawers, checking closets again as if something might have been missed. But everything told the same story. She had not left in panic, she had left with purpose, with precision, taking only what mattered, leaving behind what no longer did, and that realization settled heavier than anything else. Across the country, 30,000 feet above the ground, Emily sat with her back straight, her breathing slow and measured, her hand resting over the steady movement beneath her ribs, each small shift a reminder that she was not alone. That every decision she made now carried more than just her own weight, and yet there was no fear in her posture, no hesitation in the way she looked out the window at the endless stretch of clouds. Julian watched her for a moment before speaking, his voice low, not intrusive, simply present, asking a question that sounded less like curiosity and more like confirmation, whether she was ready for what came next, and Emily did not answer right away, because ready was not the word, not after months of quiet observation, of late nights reviewing statements, of piecing together conversations that did not add up, of recognizing patterns in Daniel's behavior that pointed to something deeper than betrayal, something calculated, something hidden. She had seen the transfers, small at first, then larger, accounts moved, assets shifted, details buried in places most people would never look, but she had looked, carefully, patiently, building a picture that did not match the life she thought she was living. When she finally spoke, her voice was calm. Almost detached, she said yes, not because she felt prepared, but because there was no version of her life left that involved going back. Below them, cities passed like distant memories, and somewhere in one of those buildings, Daniel's phone rang again. Another call, another message, another piece of a puzzle he did not understand, and as he stared at the documents spread across his counter, one thing became painfully clear: Emily had not just walked away from him. She had stepped into something far more powerful, and whatever she had uncovered, whatever she had taken with her into that sky, it was already changing everything he thought was secure. Some truths do not explode into your life, they unfold quietly until there is no way to ignore them. And that was exactly how Emily Carter had discovered everything, not in one dramatic moment but in a series of small, almost invisible inconsistencies that most people would have dismissed. It started with numbers that did not match, a transfer that appeared routine but carried a different destination, a delayed statement that arrived days later than usual, and then another, and another. Each one insignificant on its own but together forming a pattern that refused to stay hidden. Months before she ever stood outside that hotel room, Emily had been sitting alone at the dining table late at night, her laptop open, the glow of the screen reflecting in her eyes as she reviewed documents Daniel never expected her to understand, and at first she did not want to believe what she was seeing, because believing it meant accepting that the life she had built was not just unstable, it was carefully manipulated. She had always trusted him with finances, with decisions, with the structure of their future, and that trust had allowed him to move things quietly, to shift assets into accounts that did not carry her name, to reroute ownership through entities that looked legitimate on paper but told a very different story when examined closely. The deeper she looked, the clearer it became. This was not a mistake, it was preparation, not for growth, but for separation, and suddenly the timing of everything changed in her mind. The late nights, the unexplained meetings, the emotional distance that had slowly replaced the man she once knew. Back in the present, Daniel stood in his office now, not at home anymore, surrounded by advisors who spoke in careful tones, their words measured, their expressions controlled, but their message impossible to soften. Accounts were being reviewed, legal notices were pending, and the name Julian Hayes continued to surface in every conversation like a shadow he could not outrun. He demanded answers, demanded clarity, but for every question he asked, another document appeared, another detail surfaced, another indication that Emily had not acted impulsively but strategically, and the realization began to take shape in a way he could no longer deny. She had known, not just about the betrayal, but about everything else he thought he had hidden. High above, Emily leaned back in her seat, her eyes closing briefly as the steady hum of the jet filled the space around her, not loud, not overwhelming, just constant, like a reminder that movement was happening even when everything felt still. And beside her, Julian placed a folder on the table between them, sliding it forward without urgency, without pressure, because he knew she would look when she was ready. When she opened it, there were no surprises left, only confirmations, detailed reports, timelines, legal frameworks already set in motion, everything aligning with what she had discovered on her own, only now it was clearer, sharper, impossible to dispute. She traced one line with her finger, a transfer date, a number, a location, and for a moment her expression shifted, not to anger, not to sadness, but to understanding. because this was never just about leaving, it was about reclaiming something that had been quietly taken from her long before she ever realized it was missing. Far below, Daniel's world continued to narrow, call by call, page by page, until one final detail landed in front of him, an official notice bearing Emily's name, marking the beginning of a process he could not stop, and in that moment, the silence returned, heavier than before, filled not with absence, but with the undeniable truth that Emily Carter had not only walked away, she had turned everything he built into something he might not be able to keep. Control is not lost in a single moment, it slips away the second someone else understands your secrets better than you do. And that truth settled over Daniel Brooks like a slow tightening grip as he sat across from his legal team, the polished conference table reflecting the tension he could no longer hide, because every document placed in front of him carried the same quiet message: Emily had seen everything. The reports were no longer vague, no longer partial, they were complete, structured. Timelines of financial movement, asset redistribution, shell entities tied together with precision that only someone patient and determined could uncover, and the worst part was not the exposure, it was the realization that she had not confronted him, not even once. She had simply watched, learned, and waited. One attorney adjusted his glasses and spoke carefully, explaining that the filings submitted under Emily Carter's name were already in advanced stages, supported by external verification, and that the involvement of Julian Hayes meant this was no longer a private marital dispute, but a legal process backed by resources Daniel could not easily challenge, and for the first time, the room felt smaller, his control over the narrative shrinking with every sentence. He stood abruptly, pacing toward the window overlooking the city he once felt untouchable in, but now even the skyline looked distant, disconnected, as if it no longer belonged to him. Thousands of miles away, the jet had already landed, its wheels touching down smoothly on a private runway lined with quiet efficiency. No crowds, no attention, just a controlled arrival that matched everything about the woman stepping out of it. Emily moved carefully but confidently, one hand still resting over her belly, her posture unchanged, steady, composed, and waiting at the base of the stairs was a car already prepared, its door open, its destination predetermined. Julian walked beside her, not leading, not following, simply present, as if this had always been a path she would take on her own. And when they reached the car, he finally spoke again, his voice calm, explaining that what came next would not be quick, but it would be decisive, because everything she had uncovered had already been set into motion. Emily listened without interruption, her eyes scanning the quiet surroundings, not searching for reassurance, but confirming something deeper, that there was no chaos here, no unpredictability, only structure, only control. As the car door closed and the vehicle began to move, she allowed herself a brief moment of reflection, not on the betrayal that had pushed her here, but on the months of silence that had shaped her decisions, the nights spent analyzing patterns, the steady realization that she had been living inside a version of reality carefully curated by someone else. Back in the city, Daniel's phone buzzed again, this time not from his lawyers, but from a financial institution, notifying him of temporary restrictions placed on certain accounts pending review, and the words on the screen felt heavier than any accusation, because they confirmed what he had feared but refused to accept. The system itself was beginning to respond. He tried to call Emily, knowing it was pointless, knowing there would be no answer, but needing to hear the silence for himself, needing to feel the absence as something real. The call did not go through, not even to voicemail, just a clean, immediate disconnection, as if her world had already moved beyond his reach entirely. And somewhere far ahead on a quiet road, Emily Carter sat in the back seat of a moving car, her reflection faintly visible in the glass beside her, not as someone who had escaped, but as someone who had finally stepped into a position where every move ahead would be hers to make. And as the landscape shifted outside, one question lingered quietly in the space between past and future, not whether she would win, but how far Daniel Brooks would fall before he understood exactly what he had lost. The most dangerous shift is not when everything breaks, but when everything starts moving without you. And Daniel Brooks felt that shift the moment his assistant walked into his office without knocking, her usual composure replaced by something tighter, something controlled, as she placed a tablet in front of him displaying a series of headlines that had not existed an hour ago: financial irregularities under review, corporate structures questioned, and though his name was not fully exposed, yet the implications were already forming, already spreading through networks that moved faster than any damage control he could attempt. His jaw tightened as he scrolled, each line sharper than the last, each detail too precise to be coincidence, because someone had not only reported this, someone had prepared it, structured it, timed it, and he did not need confirmation to know who that someone was. Across the country, the car carrying Emily moved through a quiet stretch of road lined with tall trees and distant hills, the kind of place that did not invite attention, did not ask questions, and as the gates ahead opened smoothly, revealing a private estate set far back from the road, she exhaled slowly, not from relief, but from recognition. This was not escape, this was transition. The vehicle came to a stop, and as she stepped out, the air felt different, lighter, controlled. And waiting near the entrance was a team already aware of her arrival, not curious, not surprised, simply prepared, because everything about this moment had been set in motion long before the jet ever left the ground. Julian stood beside her again, his presence steady, his voice calm as he explained that what she had initiated was now moving beyond individual control, that systems had been engaged, reviews triggered, processes activated, and while it would take time for everything to surface publicly, the foundation had already shifted. Emily listened, her expression unchanged. But inside there was clarity, not satisfaction, not victory, but alignment, because for the first time in months, everything made sense in a single direction. Back in the city, Daniel's phone did not stop ringing. Investors, partners, legal advisors, each call carrying a different version of the same concern, uncertainty, and he answered as many as he could, his voice controlled, his responses measured. But with every conversation, the pattern became impossible to ignore. Trust was beginning to fracture, not loudly, not dramatically, but quietly, in the way people hesitated, in the way questions lingered longer than they should. He moved quickly, issuing instructions, demanding reports, trying to regain control over something that no longer responded the way it used to, and when another notification appeared, this time confirming a formal inquiry into one of his primary accounts, the room seemed to narrow again. The edges of his world drawing closer, far away, Emily walked through the entrance of the estate, the interior calm, structured, everything in its place, and for a moment she paused, not to admire it, but to register the shift fully. The space behind her closed, the space ahead entirely her own. A folder was placed in her hands, updated documents, timelines extending forward now instead of backward, outlining what would happen next, not if, but when, and as she opened it, scanning the first page, there was no hesitation, no second guessing, only a quiet understanding that this was no longer about what had been taken from her, but about what she was about to reclaim. And somewhere in the distance, beyond the walls of that quiet estate, Daniel Brooks stood in the center of a world that was no longer steady, surrounded by movement he could not control, beginning to realize that the silence Emily left behind had not been empty at all. It had been the beginning of everything that was now unfolding. There is a moment when the truth stops being something you suspect and becomes something everyone else can see. And that moment arrived quietly for Daniel Brooks as the first official notice appeared not just in his inbox, but in the inboxes of people who mattered, partners, board members, individuals who had once trusted him without question, and now those same people were requesting clarification, requesting meetings, requesting distance. The conference room that had once been a place of control now felt like a stage where every word carried weight he could no longer fully manage, and as he sat at the head of the table, listening to advisors outline potential outcomes, one phrase repeated itself with increasing clarity: exposure. They spoke of timelines, of regulatory reviews, of financial tracing, and while no one said it directly, the implication was unavoidable. Whatever Emily had set in motion was not stopping. Far from the noise of that room, Emily Carter stood in a quiet office within the estate, sunlight filtering through large windows, casting soft reflections across the documents spread neatly before her, each page representing a step forward, not backward, and for the first time since everything began, she allowed herself to slow down, to read not with urgency, but with understanding. The reports detailed more than she had uncovered alone, connections extending beyond what she had initially seen. Patterns that confirmed her instincts had only scratched the surface, and as her eyes moved across the information, there was no shock, only a deeper awareness of how carefully constructed her previous life had been. Julian stood nearby, not interrupting, not guiding, simply present, because he understood that this part belonged to her, the moment where knowledge turned into decision. When she finally looked up, her voice was steady, asking not what could be done, but what would happen next, and Julian answered with the same calm precision he had shown from the beginning, explaining that the process had already moved into its next phase, that legal actions were aligning with financial reviews, and that timing now mattered more than speed, because everything had to unfold in a way that could not be undone. Back in the city, Daniel's world continued to narrow, another notification appearing on his screen, this one more direct than the others. A formal request for documentation tied to specific transactions he had hoped would never be questioned, and for a moment, he simply stared at it, not because he did not understand, but because he understood too well. He thought of calling Emily again, not to argue, not even to defend himself, but to hear something, anything, that might shift the direction of what was happening, but the absence remained absolute, unbroken, as if she had stepped entirely beyond the reach of his voice. Outside his office, conversations had changed, quieter, more cautious, the kind of conversations that happened when people began to distance themselves without making it obvious, and that shift was something no statement could fix. Miles away, Emily closed the final page of the report and placed it back on the table, her hand resting briefly over her belly as a subtle movement reminded her of the future she was protecting, and in that moment, everything aligned again, not around loss, but around purpose. She was not reacting anymore, she was directing, and as she stood moving toward the window, looking out over a landscape untouched by the noise she had left behind, one truth settled in with quiet certainty. This was no longer about what Daniel Brooks might lose, it was about how completely Emily Carter was about to redefine everything he once believed belonged to him. Power does not disappear overnight, it erodes the moment people stop believing in it. And Daniel Brooks could feel that erosion happening in real time as he walked into a boardroom that no longer greeted him the same way, the subtle shift in posture, the delayed eye contact, the careful tone in every greeting, all signals that something had already changed beneath the surface. The meeting began without its usual rhythm, no casual conversation, no confident projections, only direct questions, presented with a level of formality that made it clear this was no longer internal discussion. This was evaluation, and as documents were projected onto the screen, the data spoke louder than any defense he could offer. Timelines aligning with inquiries, transactions highlighted with increasing precision, and the name Emily Carter appearing not as a personal connection, but as a legal entity initiating structured action. He responded, controlled, composed, explaining decisions as strategic, temporary, necessary. But even as the words left his mouth, he could feel their weight falling short, because the room was no longer listening for explanations, it was measuring risk. Across the country, in a space defined by quiet structure, Emily stood in front of a long table where a small team had gathered, not large, not overwhelming, just focused, each person aware of their role in what was unfolding. And as she reviewed the latest updates, there was no urgency in her movements, only clarity. Because everything was progressing exactly as it had been planned, step by step, layer by layer. A legal advisor outlined the next phase, explaining how the information already submitted had triggered secondary reviews, how external auditors were now involved, how timelines were narrowing toward a point where outcomes would no longer be theoretical. And Emily listened with the same steady focus she had maintained from the beginning, not reacting, not hesitating, simply absorbing and aligning. Julian remained at the edge of the room, his presence constant but unobtrusive, because this moment did not require direction, it required confirmation, and when Emily finally spoke, her voice carried that confirmation clearly. She approved the next steps without hesitation, without doubt, because there was nothing left to question. Back in the boardroom, Daniel's position continued to shift, one member requesting additional transparency, another suggesting temporary safeguards. Language carefully chosen but unmistakable in its meaning, they were creating distance, not openly, not dramatically, but enough to signal that trust was no longer absolute, and as the meeting concluded without resolution, without reassurance, he remained seated for a moment longer, staring at the empty chairs around him, realizing that the structure he had relied on was beginning to move without him. Outside, his phone lit up again, not with calls this time, but with messages, updates, notifications. Each one adding another layer to a reality he could not fully contain, and among them, one stood out, a formal notice confirming that certain assets were now under review pending further verification, the kind of notice that did not ask for permission, only compliance. Miles away, Emily stepped outside onto a quiet terrace, the air still, the horizon wide and uninterrupted, and for the first time since everything began, she allowed herself to pause completely, not to look back, not to reconsider, but to recognize the distance she had already created, not just physically, but structurally, emotionally, legally, every layer of her life now repositioned with intention. Her hand rested gently over her belly again, a small, grounding gesture, and as she looked out across the open landscape, one truth settled in with quiet certainty. This was no longer about responding to what had been done to her, it was about defining what would happen next, and somewhere behind her, in a world that was steadily shifting out of alignment. Daniel Brooks was beginning to understand that the silence Emily left behind had not been an absence, it had been the start of a process that was now moving forward without him, and there was nothing he could do to slow it down. Reputation does not collapse with noise, it fades. The moment people start asking questions they used to ignore. And for Daniel Brooks, those questions were no longer quiet or private, they were structured, documented, and now shared in rooms he no longer controlled. The next meeting was not in his office but in a larger conference space, one that felt intentionally formal, as if distance itself had been built into the environment, and as he walked in, the shift was undeniable. Fewer allies, more observers. Individuals who once deferred now simply watched, their expressions neutral but their presence heavy with implication. The presentation began without him, data projected onto a screen he had not approved, charts mapping financial paths he had hoped would remain buried, and as each slide appeared, the narrative formed clearly, not emotional, not dramatic, just factual, consistent, undeniable. He spoke when given the chance. His tone measured, his explanations precise, but every response seemed to land against a wall of quiet skepticism, because the issue was no longer whether he could explain, it was whether anyone still believed him. Across the country, Emily Carter sat at a long table reviewing the same information from a different perspective, not as something to defend, but as something to finalize, and the difference in energy was unmistakable. Where Daniel's world was tightening, hers was aligning. Each piece falling into place with deliberate timing. A senior advisor outlined the final stages, explaining how the current reviews were converging into formal conclusions, how findings would soon transition into actions that could not be reversed, and Emily listened with steady focus, her posture unchanged, her expression calm, because nothing she heard surprised her anymore. Every step had been anticipated, every outcome considered. Julian stood beside her once more, his presence consistent, not directing, not interfering, only confirming that what she had set in motion was now reaching its intended point, and when she turned a page and saw the final summary, her eyes paused for just a moment, not in hesitation, but in recognition of how far everything had come. Back in the conference room, Daniel's position continued to erode, one board member requesting a temporary review of his authority, another suggesting external oversight until matters were resolved, language careful, controlled, but unmistakable in its direction, and as those suggestions were recorded, the shift became official, no longer implied, no longer subtle, but structured into the very system he had once commanded. His phone buzzed again. A message this time from someone he had trusted for years, short, direct, advising caution, advising distance, and that was when it became clear, this was no longer contained within meetings, it had moved into perception, into reputation, into the space where recovery becomes uncertain. Miles away, Emily stepped outside again, the late afternoon light stretching across the landscape, casting long shadows that moved slowly with the setting sun, and as she stood there, the silence felt different now, not empty. Not tense, but settled, like something that had reached its natural conclusion. She placed a hand gently over her belly once more, a quiet gesture that grounded everything back to what mattered most, and as the breeze moved lightly through the air, there was no trace of doubt in her expression, no second thought, only a calm understanding that the process she had begun was no longer something that could be stopped or reversed, and somewhere far behind her, in a room that had once symbolized control, Daniel Brooks sat surrounded by people who were no longer certain of him, watching as decisions were made without his influence, beginning to realize that what Emily had taken with her was not just information, not just evidence, but the very foundation that had kept his world intact, and without it, everything else was already starting to fall away. In the end, the truth does not need a voice, it simply needs time. And for Daniel Brooks, that time had run out the moment the final report was placed in front of him, not in private, not behind closed doors, but in a setting where every word carried consequence and every silence carried meaning. The document was not long, not dramatic, but precise, outlining findings that had moved beyond speculation into confirmation, transactions verified, structures traced, intentions inferred through patterns that no longer looked accidental, and as he read through it, line by line, there was no space left for interpretation, only acknowledgement. The room remained still, no raised voices, no confrontation, just the quiet understanding that something fundamental had shifted, and when the decision was finally spoken, it was delivered with the same controlled tone that had defined every step leading to this moment, a temporary removal of authority, a formal restructuring, measures framed as necessary but understood as decisive, and for the first time Daniel did not respond immediately, because there was nothing left to argue, nothing left to explain in a way that could change what had already been set into motion. Outside, the city continued as it always had, unaware, indifferent, while inside, a structure that once revolved around him adjusted without hesitation, moving forward as if it had already prepared for this absence. Miles away, under a wide and open sky, Emily Carter stood at the edge of a quiet overlook, the horizon stretching endlessly in front of her, untouched by the noise she had left behind, and in her hands was the final confirmation she had been waiting for, not as a victory, but as closure, a document that marked the end of one chapter and the undeniable beginning of another. She read it once, slowly, her expression steady, then folded it carefully, not rushing, not lingering, simply acknowledging what it represented. Behind her, Julian remained at a respectful distance, not stepping forward, not needing to say anything, because this moment did not belong to anyone else, it was hers alone, the culmination of months of silence, of observation, of decisions made without recognition or support, and now fully realized. A soft movement beneath her hand reminded her of what mattered most, a future not defined by what she had lost, but by what she had protected, and as she looked out across the landscape, there was no trace of uncertainty in her eyes, only clarity, only direction. Back in the city, Daniel walked out of the building that had once represented everything he had built, his steps measured, his posture still controlled, but the space around him felt different now, wider, quieter, as if something invisible had been removed, leaving behind a reality he could not reshape. His phone remained silent for the first time in days, no calls, no urgent messages, just stillness, and in that stillness, the realization settled fully, not sudden, not overwhelming, but complete. Emily Carter had not just left, she had redefined the balance of everything he thought he understood, and there was no path back to the version of control he once held. Far away, as the light shifted and the sky began to soften, Emily turned slightly, her silhouette framed against the fading horizon, and without looking back, without hesitation, she took a single step forward into a future that was entirely her own, leaving behind a past that no longer had the power to follow.